Hello, everyone. Welcome to the IAPP ObservePoint web conference. 30 countries, 200 plus domains, one end goal: managing privacy compliance at scale. My name is Zachary Foote, Programming and Speaker Coordinator here at the IAPP, and I'll be your host for today's program. We'll be getting started with the presentation in just a minute, but before we do, a few program details. Participating in today's web conference will automatically provide IAPP certified privacy professionals who are the named registrants with 1 CPE credit. I also want to let you know that a recording of this program will be available in your My IAPP portal located under My Purchases and then My Recordings within 48 hours. Now, on to our program. I'd like to introduce one of today's panelists, the Chief Technology Officer at ObservePoint, Dave Smith.
Hello, everyone. I'm very excited to be here. I'm Dave Smith. We're very excited to share with you some really cool outcomes that an agency here, Loop Horizon, powered by the intrepid and amazing Matt Bentley, developed using ObservePoint as a platform for a very cool brand and some really cool results that I'm excited to share with you today. Matt, I just want to hand it over to you to introduce yourself, and I can't wait to hear all the cool things that you guys have done.
Thanks, Dave. So yeah, I'm Matt, and I'm from, as Dave said, I'm from Loop Horizon, and we like to help our clients get value from their data. And in order to do that, I'm really passionate about driving first-party data strategies. And in order to do that, clients have to generate quality data, and they have to know that they're allowed to use the data that they generate. And one of the perfect tools for helping our clients drive quality data and to understand that they can use that data is ObservePoint. So I'll hand back over to Dave to give a quick intro to what is ObservePoint.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. So ObservePoint is a technology platform that allows you to monitor technology on your website, including a lot of things that'll be interesting to this audience about privacy. At its very heart, ObservePoint is a web scanner, which means it's an automated web browser that visits your website and collects valuable information about what your website is doing to your visitors. We strive to report anything that a platform could report about your website by visiting it. And this is really important because everyone invests in some form of analytics to monitor what your users are doing to your website. But ObservePoint tells you what your website is doing to your users. Today, we'll be talking about that through a privacy lens so that you can see how ObservePoint can help you validate that your website is indeed honoring your users' consent for privacy or tracking. So ObservePoint supports many locations, many opt-in, opt-out states, including GPC, including automatic integration with several of the most popular consent management platforms. So using ObservePoint, Matt and over at Loop Horizon took advantage of this capability to provide some very interesting data to their client to show how their clients' web properties across many countries and many domains and many brands was honoring or not honoring their users' consent correctly at large scale enough that realistically this would be impossible to do manually. And so definitely needed the assistance of a technology platform and automation.
Thanks, Dave. So yeah, I work for a company called Loop Horizon. Just give a quick intro to who we are. We're a consultancy. We're a London-based boutique. We're ObservePoint partners, and we help brands transition to a customer data-driven future. You can see that was written by our marketing team. A lot of us are ex-client side. Certainly, when the company was started, we were all ex-client side. So we've been in your place. We like to think of ourselves as the translation layer. So we sit in between business requirements and technical requirements and help translate those requirements into what sometimes feels like different languages. And then the accelerate value thing, that is that we're practical practitioners, as in we actually do the technical delivery as well as the theory and the strategy, we can then take that right the way through to the build, which is what you'll see in the case study that we go through today. So the first thing is, I mean, the fact that you're on this call, on this conference, this webinar, means that you know this already, but compliance is an important thing. And I'm based in the UK, and so we've had GDPR now for 8 years. So since 2016, it's been enforceable since 2018. And so just looking at the fines, that's one aspect of why compliance is important. Since its inception, so since it was enforceable in 2018, there have been 5 billion euros of fines leveraged under GDPR. Now, that's not leverage for cookie compliance, that's for other breaches, and actually, you know, things like ePrivacy and PECR have much smaller fines, but nonetheless, there's a very strong chance that you'll be operating in a market that, or your customers will be in a market that comes under some form of legislation. So we have GDPR in Europe, we've got CCPA in the US, and IAPP has a fantastic link that we can share afterwards, tracking which states in the US have got privacy legislation, and it's at 19 states and counting. And then you've got things like the APPI in Japan, and you've got LGPD in Brazil. So there's a forever broadening range of regulation that you have to follow when you're operating in these markets, and it's only going to get more and more prevalent. But almost aside from that, another reason why compliance is so important is potential for reputational damage. So the case study we're going to talk about today, the brand in question, as you can imagine, 200 websites in the EU alone, that's a brand that had a market cap of $200 billion. Now, online research suggests that your brand is worth about 30% of your market cap. So we're talking $60 billion. And then additional online research, albeit the research that I found is from 2015, so it's before GDPR and these regulations come in, but it tends to suggest that reputational damage is worth 9 times more than any fines that you might receive. So actually, the bigger of these two, between fines and reputational damage, is going to be reputational damage, particularly for companies that are brand led. And then the last one is marketing efficiency. And actually, what I've found over the years doing this sort of stuff, I've been working on GDPR since before it came in. We knew it was coming, so probably pushing 9 or 10 years now. I've been working with making tags and cookies compliant. One of the things that we found all the way through is that actually marketing and compliance go hand in hand. So some themes within the market at the moment are deprecation of third-party cookies. So Safari has removed third-party cookies since 2019. That makes up for most brands around between 40 and 50% of their browser traffic. So you haven't been able to do marketing on third-party cookies for about 50% of your audience for the last 5 years, coming up 6 years. But also, there's a move towards server-side tagging implementations and platforming, so essentially streamlining data so that you're only sending one data feed to an endpoint, and then that endpoint is distributing it to different tools. And a really good example of this is the Google Marketing Platform, where you have one tag, the Google tag, and it will distribute data to GA4, Google Ads, DoubleClick, SA360, and all the whole range of tools that are within the Google Marketing Platform. And within the EEA, you can cannot use that signal. If Google identifies that your customer has that data for marketing purposes, unless you send consent data. So marketing efficiency and compliance are now going hand in hand, much more so than they ever did. We had a client that asked us to build and it was a Power BI dashboard. So it doesn't have to be. It could have been any visualization tool. But this one was a Power BI dashboard, and it needed to cover 200 plus sites across Europe. Also known as, I have 200 websites. How do I know if I'm compliant? It's a very difficult question to answer. So you've got pressure coming from your C-suite. In this case, the client had been given a directive from their C-suite to be compliant. And I've seen other examples with other global organizations where they've actually said that funding will be cut to a department or a subsidiary if they're not compliant. And that was a situation that another of our clients found themselves in. You also have pressure from your legal team. And what they want to do is, if they're challenged by the regulator, they want to be able to demonstrate a path towards compliance. And then you're also getting pressure from your marketing team. As described, you've got your marketing team asking if they can actually use the data that's being generated on their first party platforms, because they can't do third party tracking anymore. So, dream the impossible dream. Bit of background information for this particular case study. We were not originally brought in to build this dashboard. We were originally brought in because the client believed, they said that it was something along the lines of, they said, we're 90% certain that we are compliant. Please, can you just review our top 10 websites just to confirm that we're right and we're compliant? And what we found was that 0% of those websites were compliant. Every single one of them was setting tags and cookies, writing data to the browser, reading data from the browser without user consent. And it was in error. It was in error. The client didn't mean to be doing this, but it just demonstrates that it's very easy to get this wrong from a technical setup point of view. And actually, if you've got a situation where you've got 200 plus websites, you really need to monitor it. We also recently did a white paper scan, and again, I will ask Zach to provide the link, across the UK, over 160 brands, and we found that 70% of the brands we scanned were setting 3 or more cookies, and 85% of the brands we scanned were setting 3 or more tags before the user had granted consent. Now, that in and of itself is not non-compliant, but what it demonstrates is that actually this is quite hard to achieve. And the worst performing brand that we looked at, they were setting 44 cookies and 21 tags before the user had consented. Whereas when you looked at their consent management platform, it was telling you that all of these tags were turned off, and you could see the disconnect. You could go and check, and you could see that the tags that they were telling users were turned off were not turned off at all. And so they got it wrong. So for this particular client, they had 200 websites. They wanted to benchmark against their compliance standards. They wanted to extract that data, and they wanted to turn it into a global view. But the global view wasn't the only thing they wanted. They also wanted to be able to drill down into the view on a granular level, so that they could create actionable insights. And that's that legal team requirement for moving towards compliance. That's how you set that plan, is if you can action the insight that you generate, that's when you can start to move towards compliance. So Zach, I don't know if you want to, because this is now the next section, I don't know if you just want to take a quick moment to see if there's any questions about that first section before we move on.
Yeah, we did have one, Matt. I put it in the chat for you. It was a question about cookies. I didn't know if that was something you wanted to speak to.
Absolutely right. So it says, if everyone can see it, but cookies are only one method of capturing and passing PII to vendors, personally identifiable information. There's also data layer, session storage, and other methods. Does consent only care about the creation of cookies, or is it a bigger picture thing? It cares about everything. So cookies in and of themselves are actually, they're only actually really a way of a browser persisting data from one page load to the next. It's the collection and where that data gets sent to, and then what that data is used for is the important thing. And absolutely, any method of storing data on a browser, any method of reading that data from the browser and sending that data, and that data doesn't even have to be personally identifiable. So personally identifiable data might be something like an email address, but under GDPR, personal data is anything up to and including a cookie ID. So, and it's personal data. You can't read or send personal data without prior consent. So, absolutely, really, really great, great question. And yes, consent covers all of those mechanisms. And it's back to that point around the way that Google are managing their marketing platform and the fact that they're requiring you to send consent information with the signal is precisely that. Google Analytics is analytics and personalization. So you may have consented to analytics and personalization, but declined advertising. Well, Google Analytics can pack up audiences and send them to Google Ads. And also the Google tag on the client can also send data directly to Google Ads. So Google need to know that the data that's been received has consent to be used for advertising, even if it's set for analytics. And it's exactly that point. The cookie itself is identical; it doesn't change. Particularly with like a server-side implementation where it can just be one cookie serving ads, serving GA4, and so on. It's the downstream usage and how you intend to use that data that's important.
A great call out, Matt. Can I add one comment on that topic?
Please do.
I'm glad this question came up, because even though some legislation does specifically mention cookies, privacy legislation is generally written to avoid identifying any particular technology, cookie or otherwise. The principle at play here is all about consent, and I think Matt's used that word right on, spot on, correctly so far. And that's because when you think about what this legislation is intended to do, GDPR and all that was inspired by GDPR, like CCPA, it is intended to allow people to be able to grant or withhold consent to track them. And tracking is really the key word. Most of these laws actually say the word tracking or tracking technologies. And sometimes they say cookie or cookie-like technologies, but tracking is really what it's all about. And that may or may not have anything to do with personally identifiable information. So really what we're talking, and not just tracking, but cross-site tracking is like the most sensitive type of tracking that we're talking about, where I go to a site, it tracks me, and then I go to another site, and that second site knows somehow that I've been to that first site. That's like the most egregious form of tracking that this legislation wants to give users the option to opt out of. So that's what this is all about, is honoring users' consent. When they tell you don't track me, do you actually not track them?
Brilliant. Cool, let's move on. Lovely. So now I'm going to give some examples around ObservePoint itself. So we're now in the ObservePoint interface. And the important thing to note here is what ObservePoint is going to let you do is it's going to let you bring your consent standards into the ObservePoint platform so that they can be validated against. And this is how we did it for the case study. This is how we did it for the client. And it feeds into something Dave just said, actually, that there's no real hard and fast approach to exactly what is meant by a tracking technology. And indeed, under GDPR and under any number of different legislations, there are exemptions. Actually, I'm talking about e-privacy and PECR specifically. There are exemptions for tracking technologies, such as if the technology is required to deliver the service to the end user. So your company may decide that your chat widget is necessary to deliver the service to the end user. Another company may decide that it isn't. And what's important is there's no one hard and fast way to be compliant. It's a risk appetite that your company will have, and it's based on geographic regions. It's based on the exemptions that fall under that geographic region, under that legislation. So what's important when you're doing monitoring is that you have a tool that can flex to meet your consent standards, not some sort of hard and fast idea of what consent should be. So let's jump on to the next one, and we'll show you how that's done. Thanks, Zach. So here you can see, and this is an example from the client, from the case study, that we've got a number of tags that this client's legal team believe are classed as advertising cookies. And so what you're going to do is you're going to bring in cookies, you're going to bring in tags, you're going to bring in accepted request domains and geolocations, and you're going to bring those into Observe Point so that when it comes to run audits, it can test the reality of what your websites are doing against the expectation that your legal team have set. And just in terms of talking about importing standards, Dave, I'll just hand over to you at this point about one of the methods that you can do that.
Yeah, absolutely. What you're seeing on the screen is a screen that is part of the Observe Point platform, which allows you to specify a list of cookies and tags into a container that we call a consent category. And remember, Observe Point is trying to simulate what an actual user would experience when they visit your website. And one of those things that you want to monitor is that when a user visits your site, the correct set of cookies and tags are being set based on the consent that that user has given you, and Observe Point can simulate that consent. Well, great. You might be thinking, I've taken the time to implement a consent management platform. Perhaps I'm a OneTrust user, and I've entered dozens or hundreds of cookie names into my OneTrust configuration. Great. Well, you don't really want to have to re-enter all of those on the Observe Point side to be able to validate that your OneTrust configuration is correctly honoring your user's consent. So because of this, we've actually implemented a very simple importer tool, which can take all of the manual work out of importing your list of cookies and configurations from OneTrust into Observe Point. With just a few clicks, you can enter your domain name for your website where you've implemented your CMP. And with just a few clicks, Observe Point will import all of the cookie names and domains and descriptions into the Observe Point platform. Then you can assign that to one of your audits. And an audit is a term we use to describe the act of visiting and monitoring your website's consent. And when that audit runs, it will automatically tell you if any of those cookies or tags are not present when they should be or present when they should not be. So we call these approved or unapproved cookies and tags. So it really takes the hard labor out of doing this. You don't have to type in the names of all your hundreds of cookies anymore. We're very proud of it. We launched it just a few months ago, so you're welcome to go give it a try. Of course, anyone can do that for free at observepoint.com. You can set up a free account and try this out.
Perfect. Thanks, Dave. And actually, that feeds into one of the key principles that we applied here as well, which is that your consent management platform is your source of truth. And so by this integration that Dave spoke about with OneTrust, and I believe there are more on the way, that you can have your consent management platform be your source of truth. It also feeds into another principle, which again we applied for this client, and it came from us in conjunction with their legal team, which was there is one version of the consent standards per region. So we were able to create consent standards that should apply to every country in the EU. Now, I know within the EU, there are different interpretations on a country by country basis. This client in particular was risk averse, and so they took the most stringent of those interpretations. But what it meant was that you then would have these standards, these consent standards, and they would act as a centralized function. And by integrating that with OneTrust, it means that Observe Point can essentially slave from OneTrust, and OneTrust can remain your single version of truth. And then you can then apply that single version of truth across your entire region with these centralized functions. So for this particular case study, you can see here, we're taking, this is the audit, by the way. So it's I'm editing an audit and it's pre-consent. So this audit is what should run from a cookie perspective when the user has not consented to tracking. They've just landed on the site for the first time. And so for Europe, that is, they should only receive required cookies. For somewhere like Mexico, they can receive all of the cookies until the user opts out. So the pre-consent state would be different. But for Europe, it's you're only allowed to have the required cookies. And so what I've done is I've taken my required cookies consent group, that I've created, consent standard that I've created, and I'm applying it to that audit. And because this then is a centralized function, I can then take that and roll it out across 200 sites. And if I have multiple consent states, so pre-consent, consent declined, I've only consented for advertising cookies, I've only consented for functional cookies, and so on, that can end up being 1,000 audits, but actually there's only 4 or 5 standards that you need to apply, and they group together into one overall consent standard. And then the last thing is you run your audit and you end up with results like this. So this is looking at tag compliance. And we can see here for this particular website, there only were 2 tags. So there was only Google Tag Manager and the Consent Management Platform. They were both considered as required cookies. And so great, this particular website is compliant. But what's happening here is the audit is testing your standards, the standards that you've created from your archetype, from your domain that you've given it, and you've pulled things in from OneTrust for that domain, or you've manually created your standards. It's testing those standards against reality, what is actually happening to real users in that state. And then it's telling you if the reality of the situation deviates from what you want to happen or what you expect to happen. And Zach, I think that's the end of that section again. So I don't know if there's any more questions, or we can move on.
It looks like I think one person did want to know how does cookie use differ when using mobile apps?
So mobile apps don't use cookies. They have their own storage. Well, native mobile apps anyway. They have their own storage, so it's a slightly different scenario. But it's still tracking technology, so you still have to adhere to the same consent standards within the mobile app.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing, Matt, that with native mobile apps, there are technical differences in how tracking is achieved, but for you're still tracking potentially. And so similar diligence is needed to validate that you are honoring the user's consent, even though the technologies to do so are totally different, generally.
Great. So then how did we do the rollout from a technical perspective? So that last section was talking about how we created the archetypes. And what we did in that last section is we created the standards, and then we applied it to 5 archetype audits, all applying to the same website. So it was one website with, we checked pre-consent, consent accepted, consent declined, I've only accepted functional, I've only accepted advertising. So we had these 5 consent states, but that was then only applied to one website. So we then had to roll out that archetype build 200 times to create 1,000 separate audits. And the great thing with ObservePoint is it is API driven. And so what you can do is you can take these shared standards, and then what we did is we came up with really clear naming conventions so that when we pulled the data out, we were able to we'd be able to join that information back together. And then we used ObservePoint's APIs to essentially roll that out 1,000 times across 200 websites, which is super powerful. Like the ability to just take that and roll it out without necessarily having to get engagement from a technical team, or you've got it within your gift to just go ahead and do that using ObservePoint's API, so long as you sign in. Let's just jump to the next one. Thanks, Zach. Then, having rolled out all of the audits, and we were letting them run at a 2-weekly cadence, so every 2 weeks it was going to test all 200 sites. We created a Python script. So rolling out the audits was like a one-time thing. We then created a Python script, and we for this particular client, we sat that script within Microsoft Azure, although it could sit within any cloud environment. And it doesn't necessarily have to be Python either. That was just what we chose to do. What that script would do is there would be an automated job within Microsoft Azure, and every 2 weeks that Python script would run, and it would retrieve multiple APIs. So it would retrieve the cookie authorized versus unauthorized information. It would retrieve the tag authorized versus unauthorized information. It would retrieve all the audit names. It would retrieve what folders they were in, and so on and so forth. All of this good, rich information from the ObservePoint interface, and it would loop through 1,000 audits across 200 websites, and it would retrieve that data. And again, it was doing that via the API. And then, Dave, I just wanted to give you a chance to chip in here because there's a couple of other options around webhooks, and I think you've got a new API coming out that makes things a bit easier too.
Indeed, indeed. So Matt has done some great work here to get some of this data at scale. And of course, as you can tell, all the data that ObservePoint collects through its auditing system is available via our API. We're very committed to that. We never want to be the one hoarding data. We love to share our data with you, the client, customer, and so it is available. And historically, it has required some effort from people like Matt and other technically skilled people who can do a little bit of development to extract some of this data, especially for use cases where you have hundreds of websites. We're very happy to announce that in the coming months, we will be launching a new visualization tool, reporting. We call it our next generation of reporting, as well as new APIs that will make this a lot easier. Turns out we've seen a lot of people, a lot of corporations that are responsible for a surprisingly large number of brands like this one. And that means lots of websites, and that usually means lots of markets and geographies, and that means a lot of data. And so we're building into the product the ability to report on this data at scale across domains and across many locations. So watch for an announcement here in the coming months. We've been very hard at this, very hard at work on this, and I think it's going to be really, really great.
Brilliant. Cheers, Dave. So then once the Python script would run, it then pulls the data back into and combines it into a table. So the reason that the new API that's coming out will pre-combine this information. When we did this, we had to bring multiple data tables together and join them together. So that's what we did once the data landed back in Azure. It's also really important to point out as well that none of this data that we're retrieving from ObservePoint is customer data. So it's one of the big sort of things that clients who use the tool sort of this struggle with to begin with, is because this is ObservePoint scanning the website to check that it is working in the way that it is expected. It's ObservePoint's data. ObservePoint is the user. It's pretending to be the user, and it's going through the web pages. So none of this information coming back from ObservePoint is personal data to an end user or personally identifiable. Or if it is personally identifiable, it's personally identifiable to ObservePoint servers because they are the customer in this case. So it doesn't, none of the legislation applies to this data when you pull it back out. It's all perfectly good. So we pull the data and pull it down into a table, and then because this was done in Azure for this particular client, we set a Power BI dashboard on top of the data, and we're going to give you a demo of that in a minute. But again, because it's standard data, it's just data coming out in table format. It's JSON format essentially, but it's data coming out in a table format. You could set any data visualization tool on top of this and get similar results. So cool. So just before I jump onto the dashboard demo again, are there any questions from the last section just before I move on?
Yeah, Matt, someone's asking, can you touch on at all on advanced consent for OP scans? Under advanced consent, what is allowed to be sent to vendors in an uncontested state? As example, purchase confirmation pixel sent to Adobe Analytics with various variables.
Just read that one to me again, sorry.
Sure. Can you touch on advanced consent for OP scans? Under advanced consent, what is allowed to be sent to vendors in an unconsented state? As an example, a purchase confirmation pixel sent to Adobe Analytics with various variables.
So the advanced consent mode, and thanks for repeating it. The advanced consent mode that I'm familiar with is the GA4 advanced consent mode. So I don't know if that relates exactly to this question. I might not be answering the question that's been asked, but advanced consent mode for GA is sending data without a cookie. So essentially, you're sending a hit from the browser to Google Analytics, and you're not including a cookie ID. You're including a unique identifier for that page load. And so when the page reloads, because there's nothing to connect one page load in the browser to another page load in the browser, essentially those hits are disconnected. And this is Google's way of enabling users to send data to GA4 in an unconsented state. Now, what they then do with it on the back end is they will then model that data, and they'll use the existing data that does have cookie IDs as a training model, and they'll remodel that data to basically try to re-sessionize to turn that hit level data into user level data. The jury's still out from a GDPR and e-privacy perspective as to whether that is acceptable. A lot of brands are doing it. A lot of brands are using that advanced consent mode feature. And ObservePoint can replicate that. Obviously, you can take a user and run them in advanced consent mode for GA, for example, through ObservePoint, and check that no cookie is being set and so on. So you can validate advanced consent mode as well. But yeah, as I said, the jury is still out on whether GA4 advanced consent mode is actually compliant, because if you get right down to the letter of the law with something like e-privacy, you're not allowed to set or read information from the browser without the user's consent. And the other problem with something like GA4's advanced consent mode is that because it's setting this page level identifier, actually a lot of companies have got single page app checkout journeys, for example, or single page app product journeys, and they'll send multiple hits to GA without actually reloading the page. And in that scenario, you are able to tie those multiple hits together. And so realistically, is it really adhering to the letter of what the legislation says? I hope that answers the question. I'm not clear on the Adobe bit, so I went with a GA4 answer instead.
And maybe one little thing to add on the ObservePoint side. If you have a situation where you have done exactly what Matt has described, where you want to allow your users who are not in a consent state yet, meaning they have not given consent for tracking, but you want to use a technology like GA4, Adobe Analytics, or any other technology with certain limitations where you're not sending certain information to be able to identify or track that user, that can be validated as well with ObservePoint's rule system. It can go down to the variable level, and you can set up rules that would say, hey, for this consent state, ObservePoint, I want you to validate that we're not including these variables and that we are including these variables for this particular technology.
Great. And then just touching on the Adobe point, the reason I'm not that familiar is I don't believe Adobe has a mechanism for re-sessionizing and training the data back again after the fact. But you could, in theory, in the same way that you do with GA4, you could send hit level data without cookie ID, and one of our clients actually does that, I believe. Cool. So I'm going to share my screen now and give a really quick demo of this the outcome dashboard. So let me just share. Okay. So hopefully that's coming through, and I'll move off to one side. So then I can actually see the screen I'm working on now. So this was the dashboard that we pumped out of the other end. This is a demo dashboard, so it's not real data. You can see that there isn't 1,000 audits. There's 829. And if we look at the markets, we've replaced the real markets with randomly generated ones, and similarly, the domain names are random generated words. So it's we're okay to look at it. It's all right. So if we look at this, we can see that we've got cookie compliance. And again, this isn't the real compliance rate. We randomize the data, but what you've got here is that output from ObservePoint of here are the number of authorized cookies, here are the number of unauthorized cookies, and then what's the percentage of each across 200 websites and 1,000 audits. 829, but you take my point. Similarly, tags. Here are the authorized ones, here are the unauthorized ones, and what's your percentage? The interesting thing here is scan success, because one of the things I've been really clear about throughout is that it's your consent standards. So what if you're using OneTrust, for example, but one of your websites isn't? One of your local brands is using a different consent vendor. They're going to struggle to adhere to your consent standards. And so one of the things we would also measure is, can the scan actually proceed using the consent standards that we've given it? Because if it can't, then there's a failure point there, and we need to go and speak to each of those individual markets. Now, that at a top level meets that C-suite requirement. We want to be able to track compliance over time, so we can see that it's improved. We also have the filters. So let's look at consent in a pre-consent state, and we can see that things get worse. So there's a lot more unauthorized cookies in this consent state. Then let's look at a couple of the markets. So we'll just select a few. And we can see that that dashboard was jumping around there, and you could see that it was adding more data in, taking data out, and so on. This now starts to meet the marketing, sorry. Yes, sorry, it meets the marketing requirements, which is that the marketing team wanted to be able to understand on a granular level whether they can use the data that they're generating. So your marketing team could come into this dashboard, drill down to their market and drill down to their specific domains, and they will be able to understand if the data that they're generating, their first party data is compliant. Separately, we gave the client this sheet, which gives them an overview of each of the individual markets, each of the individual countries. And at the bottom here, we've got the number of domains in each. This starts to then feed into the legal team requirements, which are that they want to have a path towards compliance. And so this particular page here gives the legal team the ability to target the markets with the lowest compliance but the highest number of domains. And so when the regulator comes to speak to them, they can say, we're working towards compliance and here's how we're doing it. We're targeting these markets first because they've got the lowest compliance rates and they've got the highest number of domains. So we're maximizing the impact of our activity. I'll just stop sharing there. And then let's jump back onto the slide deck. Thanks, Zach. And so the idea with that final requirement, the one from the legal team, is that then the team could jump back into Observe Point once they've pinpointed a domain or a suite of domains that are non-compliant, and Observe Point is going to tell them why it's non-compliant. And so you can see here that you've been able to drill right down to an individual domain level, and we can check and we can see that here is an unapproved tag. Now you've got 3 actions. So this is now actionable insight. You've got 3 actions you can take off the back of this. You can tell the individual team to stop using the tag because it sits outside of your compliance standards. You can get them to move it to the correct consent group, so they don't have to stop using it. But if it's an analytics tag, but it was firing when advertising tags were selected, for example, you can say, no, you need to put this tag into the analytics group. Or if it just transpires that it was missing from the consent standards that you brought in, and actually it's perfectly fine to use this tag, you can just add it to the consent group, and you can see there's a plus there to do it literally straight out of the audit. You can just chuck it into the relevant consent group. But this is then what we mean about actionable insight. So taking this global dashboard and going right from a top level 200 websites, how compliant am I across the board that your C-suite wants to see, drilling right the way down to an individual tag on an individual site and making a decision about that tag to move towards compliance. And so at the end of this process, the client had, as I've mentioned, their global C-suite dashboard. So C-suite was happy. Their funding was not cut. All budgets remained intact, so that was good news. Their legal team was happy, and actually, it's an interesting thing. I had a conversation with the same client recently, one of the things they're finding in the US, which we didn't see with the Europe team, so I was speaking to their global team at this point, one of the things they're finding in the US is they're having to more and more field individual litigation. So individuals who don't think that that company on one of their websites is compliant actually getting a lawyer and taking legal action, which we don't really get in Europe. But it was a really interesting conversation because I hadn't really considered it before, but actually having that roadmap and being able to demonstrate that you're moving towards compliance at a granular level helps you field those individual complaints as well. So the legal team is now happy. And the marketing team were happy because they could now go into that dashboard and find out that they did have the right to use the data that they were generating, and then they could start to leverage their first-party data strategy and get a more effective marketing strategy in place than their historic ones. So I guess, do we want to, before we move on to any questions, Zach, I don't know, I think you've got a couple of slides.
Yeah, well, yeah, those are just some housekeeping slides at the end, and I'm going to share the survey link in the chat as well. But I didn't know, yeah, if you and Dave wanted to, we've got a few minutes to see if anybody had any additional questions. We certainly have time for that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, people could either put it in the chat or in the Q&A function. Either way, if anyone has any follow-up questions.
I'll jump over to the Q&A.
Everybody got real shy all of a sudden. Well, and that's okay. And I do know if anybody has any questions that is here with us live right now or is watching this webcon at another time, they're always welcome to contact us at the IPP. And I know both Matt and Dave's information was shared earlier in the PowerPoint and is also available. I know if you want to reach out to either of them, they'd be more than happy to communicate with you.
Yeah, more than happy to chat to people on LinkedIn.
And I did put the survey in the chat, and unless anybody else has any other questions, or Dave or Matt, did you have any closing arguments, as it were, before I go over some of my last bits?
Just want to say thank you, everyone, for being here, and thank you, Matt, for this great work delivering this valuable outcome to this customer, this client of yours. And thank you, everyone, for your time.
Yeah, I'll echo that. Thanks, everyone, for coming, and thanks to ObservePoint and IAPP for having me and for letting me talk for as long as you have.
Absolutely. So yes, again, thank you to both Matt and Dave, and Matt again with Loop Horizon, and Dave with our sponsor of today's webcon, ObservePoint. So thank you very much for sharing all of this with us and our members. I want to encourage everyone again, if you haven't already, to make sure to click the survey link that was put in the chat so you can give us some feedback on today's program. It helps us improve our future web conferences. So we very much appreciate your feedback. That wraps up the program here today. I want to thank you all so much for joining us, and we hope to see you again at a future IPP web conference. Thank you, everybody.